Once the breach was opened and Catholicism was no longer the only singular religion for Europeans, others began to enter this discussion for the confessional lives of Europeans. The assault that Luther had begun, the revolution that Luther had defined, in fact had broken forever the unity of Christendom, at least as it was referred to and understood in the traditional way on the continent. And the effect of this was to be enormous because Europeans then saw different instruments by which they could define themselves and how they would relate to one another. They in fact could see that the nature of the confessional community could in fact be described by events other than those determined externally by popes or by bishops or by councils. That in fact their religion could be close to home and help define themselves and their community in a way that was extremely intimate. So Luther then, in beginning his revolution, didn't just rend that seamless robe of Christ. He in fact began a process that allowed for Europeans a new form of self-definition, one that was much more local and much more determined by events closer to home. And for that reason, this revolt was extraordinarily significant and important. But Luther was not the last word. When we think of the Lutheran Revolution, we think of the beginning of that huge event that lasted almost an entire century, known as the Reformation. And after Luther, a number of others began to question not just the traditions of the Roman Church, but also Luther's response to those issues, and question him as well. The most important leader of that second generation of reformers was Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli was a Swiss priest, and also he was a Christian humanist. He was one of those individuals who, like Moore and Erasmus, sought inspiration and knowledge about God and religion and the Spirit through study as well as through prayer. So Zwingli was an extraordinarily sophisticated man, and because of this and because of his learning, he was appointed the public preacher in the Swiss city of Zurich. He used this office to direct the religious reformation of that city. And he began then a new form, a new elaboration of religious reform that really moved away from Lutheranism and towards a different model of confessional allegiance, one in which the distinction between the laity and the church essentially evaporated altogether. Zwingli's teachings were independent of Luther's theology, and they were a product not only of his humanist education and biblical scholarship, but his belief that to some extent Luther had not gone far enough. Luther accepted in a form the idea of transubstantiation, and that is that during the miracle of the Mass, the wafer and the wine actually become the body and blood of Christ. Well, to Zwingli, this doesn't happen. If you need a miracle, then you need a magus, a magician, to perform it. And then that goes back to this idea of a closed caste of priests that have magical powers that come with ordination. So Zwingli rejected that. He suggested that the Eucharist isn't in fact a time when the body and blood of Christ are present on the altar, but it's merely a commemoration. It's merely a memory to link the current faithful with the experience of Christ on earth. So no magic takes place. It doesn't happen on an altar where a sacrifice occurs. It happens at a table. And the person who does it needs no magical entry into a closed caste. It can almost be done by anyone. Zwingli then took Luther's idea of the priesthood of all believers to a logical extreme. If there's no need for a closed caste of priests, then what becomes the difference between the laity and the clergy? Is there any difference at all? Are the clergy not just laymen who happen to be learned in areas that have to do with divine revelation, biblical scholarship in particular? Do they not just have particular skills, such as the skills of rhetoric for effective preaching? Are they not models of behavior? But they aren't separated out by some kind of magical ordination. So the distinction between the laity and the clergy largely disappears in Zwingli's model. Also, like Luther, he completely disagreed with the concept of monasticism, and so Zurich, like Luther in Germany, closed all of the convents and monasteries, and all of the images were removed from churches as well. This, in some ways, was a great loss because the whitewashing of churches, the smashing of the stained glass, the destruction of the statues of saints and the Virgin, all of these things greatly reduced the cultural patrimony of a continent. But nevertheless, they were part of the reform that Zwingli saw as necessary. Religion should be an inner matter having to do with the spirit. It shouldn't be controlled by images on the outside. So Zwingli was perhaps a bit more radical than Luther, going further, pushing this religious envelope farther and farther away from any of the practices and traditions of Catholicism. But if there's going to be then no distinction between cleric and a layman, if the churches were in fact to be places of individual spiritual renewal and celebration, where no magic takes place, then in fact, who is responsible for the moral guidance and the operative morality of society? These things had always been part of canon law. They had been part of the jurisdiction of the church. Now Zwingli, with his lack of distinction between cleric and layman, says that this is no longer part of the jurisdiction of the church, it's part of the jurisdiction of the community of which the church is part. So the idea then of the council, the city government of Zurich, taking over the responsibility for public morality, to take over the responsibility for those elements of canon law that had governed behavior, these things then must in fact be placed under the control of those officers who are responsible for the community, that is, the city government, the magistrates who rule over the city of Zurich. Moreover, this was important for Zwingli, and we'll see it as even more important to John Calvin, because it was believed by the second generation of reformers that humans are in fact fallen. They are extremely, they have great proclivity towards sin. So it's necessary then for the community to ensure that there is a control over this proclivity towards sin. This dangerous desire to act in an ungodly way as a consequence of being born imperfect. So Zwingli saw the city government then as imposing a kind of moral regulatory function. The actions of individuals, private as well as public, needed to be controlled in order to inhibit their tendency to act in an ungodly manner. He believed then that it was absolutely necessary for the community to be educated, to be led toward a good life, and to understand the nature of their responsibility to the community. This council then replaced canon law courts that were active before the Reformation. They functioned as regulatory offices to ensure that public morality would be observed, and also to ensure that private behavior would be seen as appropriate in this godly community in which the secular power had the right to ensure that behavior would correspond to some idea of religious value. And in order to make sure that those who were not performing in this way would be seen and caught and chastised, Zwingli established a network of spies and informers to look through windows, to listen carefully at doors, to hear if people were dancing, if they were engaging in drunkenness, if they were blaspheming, or if their behavior in any way was inappropriate. And if so, they would be denounced to the council, and the council would then chastise them, or in fact punish them, using the secular power of the state. Well, Zwingli was killed in 1531 during one of the early wars of religion. He had already succeeded in converting 6 cantons in Switzerland to his new faith, but his early death ensured that Zwinglianism would remain a relatively localized function. But nevertheless, his elaboration of this new religion indicates just how Luther's revolt has resulted in the fragmentation of the spirit of Europe, of the confessional allegiance of the entire continent. Because with the rise of Zwinglianism, which could not be reconciled with Lutheranism, there was an attempt, but it didn't work because it failed over this issue of the Eucharist. Luther would not accept that it was a mere commemoration, and the Zwinglians would not accept any form of transubstantiation. So what is happened then is that Christendom has now been divided into a group of mutually exclusive sects, those that will not recognize one another's theological basis and will not accept the teachings of the others. So it's not just the division between Lutheran and Catholic. There is now a division amongst all of the Protestant sects with one another, as well as their opposition to traditional Catholicism. Zwingli also performed another function. He provided the precondition, he provided the circumstance that allowed for the rise of John Calvin. John Calvin, by far the most important of that second generation of reformers. Who was Calvin, and what did he say, and how did it differ from Zwingli, and particularly how did it differ from Luther and the Roman Church? Well, it's important to know who Calvin was. Calvin was a Frenchman born in Noyon, France, the son of a notary and parliamentarian. He originally, like Luther, was sent to study law so that he could follow in his father's career, but he spent much more time discussing theology and with the humanists, those Christian humanists that were arising in Paris. The influence of Christian humanism on Calvin is extraordinarily important, as it was on Zwingli, but more so with Calvin because Calvin actually put this into a large book that helped define how the individual was to perform in the context of the community. Because Calvin saw Christianity and civic virtue as being necessarily combined. Humanism, after all, saw civic virtue as being put in place as a secular instrument to build community based on shared values so that policy could then further the goals and values of the community and to achieve the ends that everyone sought. Christianity, of course, was to ensure that the faithful would reach salvation. Well, Calvin put these two together. And he saw that civic virtue and civic morality and Christian virtue and Christian morality should be in fact one and the same. He agreed with Zwingli that there was really no distinction between the clergy and the laity. And so why then should there be two concepts of morality or two concepts of virtue? They're in fact one and the same. Also, he strongly agreed with Zwingli that mankind was sinful by nature and had a proclivity towards committing sin if given an opportunity or if not fully controlled. Calvin, though, believed that this proclivity towards sin could in fact be very, very much suppressed, and that even the sinners could lead a life that was a Christian life, provided the right forms of, we would say, repression, and he would say control, were in place. So he believed strongly that it was necessary for the community to put in place laws, restrictions, morality, and controls to ensure that all members of the community would lead a Christian life that honored God. Again, it's important to know here who Calvin was. Calvin studied law. He thought like a lawyer. He thought in terms of crime and punishment. He thought in terms of legalistic descriptions, and he used the rhetoric of law and of civility in order to further and to develop his perspective. Calvin's legalistic mind then was very much at work in creating the community that he was to guide, and also to create the book that was to define his religious elaborations and to really give the essence of Calvinism some measure of shape. Well, Calvin was still in France when he was caught publicly preaching his Reformed belief and ran into a great deal of trouble, and so he wisely left France in 1533, never to return. He first went to the Swiss city of Basel, and there he began that book that was to define the religion that he was to begin, the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which he first began, and the first volume of which appeared in 1534. Calvin, though, didn't stay in Basel. Basel was not his natural home. He was attracted to the spiritual and civic transformation that was underway in the city of Geneva. Geneva was a relatively large city of about 10,000 people that had begun a Reformation but needed someone to guide it. And in 1536, John Calvin moved to Geneva, and this was to be the place where he would institutionalize and structure his theology and make it the most famous example in Europe of a city transformed by the Reformation. He was to turn it into what he saw as the New Jerusalem, as the guiding light and the model of Calvinist existence, of a godly society in which those who were doomed to sin would in fact be controlled by those who recognized godliness. Calvin wanted to turn the city then into a living example of his new faith. And his was, like Zwingli's, a great simplification of religion. And he believed that the only authority that should be recognized were in fact biblical authorities. None of the traditions of the church really mattered. None of the actions of Christendom over the millennium and a half since the time of Christ really mattered for much. All that really was significant to Calvin is the revelation that came from scriptural sources. So he began then to create this new world. He began to put together a form of government and a new kind of society that would, he thought, liberate those who were godly from those who were sinful, when in fact he created a very different kind of world. The city became, as I suggested, a New Jerusalem for those who shared his opinions, and it attracted those who were converted from all over Europe to live within it so that they could be part of this new godly society. But for others, it was a living hell. Those who didn't agree with Calvin, but who stayed in the city, found themselves seriously repressed. And those who came to Geneva with ideas that Calvin opposed found themselves persecuted occasionally unto death. The most famous and tragic example being the great medical scholar Michael Servetus. Servetus, who really came up with the theory of the circulation of the blood before William Harvey, one of the great explorers of human anatomy and medicine, was burned by John Calvin in 1553. Again, an act for which it's difficult to forgive him, but nevertheless one that reflected again Calvin's view that the city must conform, and those who refuse to conform must be corrected, and if they refuse to be corrected, then they must be cut off from the branch of the living. The underlying cause of John Calvin's torment was his view of God, and really an Old Testament God, a stern, almost vicious disciplinarian. Calvin saw God as omnipotent and omniscient, whose deeds were unknowable. How could a human being, with all of the limitations of being human and being creatures and creations of God, possibly understand the deeds and intentions of the divine? So all we could do was, to use his terms, suffer and obey. We, in fact, had to try and understand God's plan for man, and we have to realize we never will. So we simply have to accept it. And because God is omnipotent and omniscient, so he must have known from the beginning of time, from the creation of the world, the names of those who were destined to be saved and those who were destined to be damned. And there was nothing that anyone could do about it. Salvation or damnation then were preordained. And this concept of predestination became a central element of Calvinism. It became part of the Calvinist theology and also gave a good deal of definition, a good deal of coherence, and a huge amount of energy to this new religion. But because we don't know whether we're saved or damned, Calvin said it is necessary to lead a life that is not only pleasing to God, but in no ways interferes or offends the godly. So you have to control the inhabitants of Geneva. You've got to control their moral lives. You have to control their inner lives, because it's not just their external actions that matter. It is also their internal thoughts and beliefs. Calvin then created a new model of governance for Geneva. The city-state became a kind of New Jerusalem, to be sure, but it also became a petri dish. It became an experiment in social and political control. He established a very strict hierarchy of authority, beginning ultimately with God. It was a theocracy, Geneva, and this chain of command went down until ultimately all were included. Moreover, because men and women have no idea whether they were saved or damned, whether in fact they had the right to behave in a godly way, was irrelevant. Calvin insisted that anything that indicated that you were reprobate, that you were not saved, anything that would offend the saved committed by the reprobate, all of these things would have to be suppressed. Consequently, those who drank too much, those who sang publicly, those who danced, those who played cards, those who gambled, those who engaged in the normal pleasures of 16th century life were seen as committing crimes against the Holy Spirit, against God himself, as interpreted in this theocracy by John Calvin. So the instrument by which they were to be corrected, the instrument by which they were to be punished, again as with Zwingli's Zurich, was the town government. And Calvin put together a consistory of lay elders, not clerics, but laymen, powerful patricians in the city who accepted Calvin's view of religion. This lay consistory had the right to discipline, to excommunicate, in other words, to drive out of society, and to punish those then who refused to be corrected. This then was a dramatic moment, because what Calvin had done is created by completely destroying any distinction between the laity and the clergy, a kind of theocratic state in which all members of any form of disciplinary body could exercise divine power. So those who accepted it, those who were part of this world of Geneva, saw it as divinely ordained, as perfect. It was a place where, in fact, they could lead godly lives without having to see, let alone participate in, ungodly acts. But as I said, those who did not share this view found themselves in the most repressive society imaginable. So we have to ask ourselves, why was it so popular? Why was Calvin's view of the world, this dark view of this angry God, so appealing to so many of Europe's citizens? Calvinism spread quickly and broadly through half of France, to Scotland, through the Low Countries. It was an extremely popular religion. Why? Well, the reason, I think, is really quite simple. The second generation after the Reformation found itself faced with a huge moral and personal and confessional problem. The grandparents, in some instances the parents of these citizens, had given all of their discretionary income, had bankrupted the community to build lady chapels, to build wonderful statues of the Virgin, to decorate the walls with beautiful images of salvation, only to see their generation smash those windows, destroy those sculptures, and whitewash those walls. They were confused. Who was right? Were your grandparents right? Or are you right? Is John Calvin talking the truth, or the Catholics who were saying, in fact, that he's the Antichrist? Who's right? The thing about Calvin is that his religion is so clear. It's yes or no. It's wrong or right. There is no easy way out of this recognition of you are either you're either following God's will or you are not. You are either saved or you're reprobate. So this clarity, this extreme simplification of religion to a group of rules that became clearly defined in a legalistic way, Calvin was a lawyer, allowed for those confused people who didn't know what to believe anymore to find some measure of spiritual comfort. Cults work in a similar way today, attracting those who are confused and dislocated, and they find that they have simple answers to complex problems. And to some extent, Calvin provided that. The other thing about Calvinism is that it could spread so easily because of its organizational structure. It was organized with local cells that operated completely independently. There was no pope, there were no bishops, so it was not necessary to pay attention to anyone outside your immediate community, especially if you were working in secret. Because all you needed was the Bible and the Institutes of the Christian Religion, Calvin's book. If you had these two things, you could form a Calvinist cell. That conventicle could be seen as orthodox, and you then could call yourself a Calvinist and believe that you were acting in a way that Calvin was interpreting as appropriate and godly. Moreover, those in these independent conventicles, in these churches and cells throughout Europe, saw themselves very, very much as members of the elect. Have you ever met a Calvinist who believes and recognizes himself or herself as reprobate, as going to hell? They all believed that they were among the elect, that they were going to heaven for sure. They were the godly souls. So they wanted to witness for their faith. They engaged in acts of incredible courage and daring. They were willing to suffer terrible punishments and torture in order to witness for their faith, because this was the outward and visible sign of their salvation. That they were among God's elect, and that regardless how you may burn the body, the soul shall certainly be saved. Calvinists then suffered not only at the hands of the Catholics, but at the hands of the Lutherans and a number of other sects that saw them as dangerous and in many ways as divisive. But Calvin, in fact, had established something very, very significant. He established a religion that could move easily, establish roots almost anywhere, that could be simply structured, and that had essentially two basic texts, the Bible and the Institutes of the Christian religion. It then allowed for the spread of this message from one side of the continent to the other. Calvin, though, went further. He was a very organized man. He also was committed to education. He was, remember, a Christian humanist as well as being a reformer. In 1559, a university was opened in Geneva, a university whose purpose was to evangelize and convert other Christians to Calvin's theology. They were to work among the Catholics and among the Lutherans and others. Also, they were to produce books and pamphlets and sermons that allowed for the description of this new faith to set down some platform on which a larger church could ultimately be built. Geneva then became the source and the inspiration for this entire community. Geneva became the model community of every Calvinist nation. But these nations, in fact, found themselves in different circumstances. They faced different problems and different conditions because, after all, Europe is not a totality with a singular culture, and what Calvin had managed in the city-state of Geneva would be much more difficult in a great kingdom such as France. In France, the Calvinists became very popular, and indeed the religion spread, especially in the south and west. It was attractive particularly to wealthy members of town councils. These urban mercantile elite found that the strictures of feudalism that survived in France not only restricted them economically and socially, but also restricted them culturally and intellectually. And Calvinism provided a kind of cultural model that they could then adopt and give themselves an identity that was in contradistinction to the values around them, values still defined very much by the landholding nobility and the monarchy. Consequently, town councils and urban dwellers were very attracted to Calvinism. And then secondly, for political reasons, the lesser nobility saw Calvinism as a way of uniting against the great feudatories and the power of the monarch. They saw then Calvinism as a kind of ideology that would allow them to set down roots and to give them, again, a definition that was not the definition of the traditions of France, that allowed them to stand up and be seen and respected by the great nobles who previously saw them as their vassals. So these classes, these very dynamic classes of the lesser nobility and the urban mercantile elite, saw Calvinism as a way of putting pressure on forces that seemed to want to repress them and seemed to try and inhibit change. So, as we'll see in a subsequent lecture, the success of Calvinism in France would lead to the division of the nation and to the rise of the terrible French wars of religion. Indeed, the rise of Calvinism in France, where they were called Huguenots or Huguenots, would lead to not just the wars of religion themselves, but to one of the most awful events of all of European history, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre of 1572, which we will discuss in the next lecture. So, what Luther began and what Calvin and Zwingli continued resulted in the division of Europe, the fragmentation of Europe into a number of religious sects. Religion, again, being a defining element for social, political, and economic groups that were looking for new models of behavior and new structures that would challenge a world that they saw as keeping them under subjection. So not only was the spirit freed by these individuals, not only did the Reformation allow the individual to approach God on his or her own terms, but also there was very much a freeing of the imagination and of a sense of power. They saw a new Europe being born, driven by the power of new religious ideas and a vocabulary that permitted, in fact, encouraged change. And when change happens in Europe, it is very often violent change. And in the next lecture, we will see, in fact, how the Reformation gave rise to warfare and destruction on a scale that it's very difficult for us to imagine.